provide broadcasting and media training for young Australians. All of our content that we create are by young people for young people. Thanks to Maramanon Council for having us share our isolation creation.
Hi, and I'm Rebecca, and in today's isolation creation, the SYN Media learning team will be taking you through how to plan your podcast production. Now that you have a bit more of a clear idea of your topic, how can you bring it to life? And producers take on many roles, and we're going to explore some of these production roles now. Remember to pick one topic for your episode. We're thinking about podcast episodes as though they were chapters of a book, so you can't cover every bit of information in one episode. Plus, you want to give your listeners something to come back to and keep them engaged for the next episode. So if that's a fiction podcast, you might end on a cliffhanger, or you might end your episode with a few questions or tease what's coming up in upcoming episodes. Think also about what voices and other sounds your audience will hear, whether that's other guests, interviews, soundscapes, atmosphere, sound effects, and music. You'll also need to consider what interviews or guests you want to add to your program, especially if it's a talks-based podcast. We'll talk a bit more about this in our next session. Most importantly, with all these elements going on, you're going to need a strong plan and a clear run sheet. There's so much to remember, so keep track of it on a run sheet. So let's recap. You'll need to structure your episode with one topic for the best result. And if it's a fiction-based podcast, you'll need a clear beginning, middle, and end, just like you would if you were writing a story. Just like chapters in a book, the umbrella theme is the same, and each chapter is a related topic with a more specific focus.
Knowing that we have one topic per episode, we need to make certain considerations to ensure that our podcast hits the mark. First of all, we need to think about our angle. How are you going to tackle the conversation? And what voices are we going to be hearing? There are so many different styles and genres and ways that you can do this, but just pick one that suits you. What is it exactly that you're going to be exploring in your podcast? Remember, we need to be really specific. If you have a co-host, what are they going to share? If you decide to invite a guest, what can they bring to the table? You also need to think about why. Why have you chosen this topic? And the people that you brought on board, why are they the right candidate? When we're also thinking about why, we consider our listeners. Why should our listener care? Knowing your motivations for the episodes, your podcast, will help direct this question. And finally, when. When your listener finishes listening to your podcast, what impact do you wish to have on them? It's always good to set goals.
So let's talk a little bit about interview guests. First of all, consider who they are. Are they a professional? Can they offer personal insight and experience? Or maybe they can share an anecdote. They might also have a personality that makes the podcast a bit more engaging. In another way, they might be shy and a bit more reserved, and you might need to put in a bit more effort to tease out the conversation. But most importantly, think about what impact your guest will have on your podcast, just by who they are. Consider why you're interviewing them. That gets back to personal experience or anecdotes they might be able to share, or they might be an expert on an issue, which is really common. Also consider the timeliness of when you choose to conduct your interview. Is it in the morning? Is it in the evening, maybe when everyone's tired and had a long day? Try and work out a time that works best for you and your guest.
But also, research. It's really important that you're familiar with the guests that you will be interviewing. The more familiar you are with them, the easier the conversation and flow of the interview will be. It's always best to speak to the person who you are interviewing way before the actual interview. First, a phone call to initiate it, but then also have a little bit of a chat and get to know each other, get familiar. Confirm your interview either through a text message or an email. It's always best that everyone knows what time of day it's happening and when. If you're working with a co-host, make sure that they are also aware of what the interview is going to be about and who you're interviewing. Maybe dedicate certain questions to certain co-hosts. Think about your audience as well. How is the audience going to receive this interview?
So let's take a closer look at some of these podcast production roles. First of all, presenters. That role probably comes immediately to mind because it's likely the first voice we'll hear in the podcast. If you're the presenter, or also called the host, you have a big role in determining the tone, the mood, and the style of the piece. So think about how you can use your voice to emphasize words, and think about what sort of mood you want to create for the listener. Second of all, the narrator, and this might be a more common role in fiction or story-based telling podcasts. You might need to relay important bits of information to the listener as the episode goes along. And if it's a non-fiction style podcast, you can work as that bridge between interviews. Third of all, scriptwriter. Now, the scriptwriter would not be writing the script word for word. It's not an essay or a speech, and it's quite conversational. You might like to script very closely the introduction and outro to set the context and relay important information at the bookends of your episode. Otherwise, the scriptwriter would be detailing what important points need to be hit in each segment. Finally, the researcher. This is one production role that involves digging in deep to where you can find out all the information and setting the context for your episode. There are many ways you can research. Obviously, the internet is a big source, but you might also conduct some more informal research, reaching out to stakeholders and people impacted by the issue. You might like to conduct some vox pops, that's voice of the people. And in a remote setting, you might not be able to go out onto the street to get public opinion, but you could also ask people to inbox you or send little email snippets of their opinion on an issue.
The audio technician operator makes sure that all the gear that's involved is working and recording properly. They may also set up the space so that there are no recording hazards and that it is user-friendly. They would also operate any microphones or recording devices that have been used and making sure that the levels are all good on their audio. We don't want any peaking. They want to make sure that everyone's sounding their best. Sourcing sound effects can be a job shared between the audio technician, operator, and editor, and these sounds can be used to enhance your conversation or storytelling in your episode. The editor. The editor does work post-production. Firstly, they consolidate all of the audio files that you've recorded and any sounds that you want to use. Using a digital audio workstation, the editor takes these recordings and edits them so that the end product is clean and professional. The editor also has creative control on how your episode is going to be structured and what's going to be included. They can be layering sounds, adding any music, jingles. This can be free to use or sounds that they've created themselves, and adjust the levels on any audio and removing any unwanted sounds. Remember, one person can perform multiple roles, or these roles can be given out to individual team members. How long should your podcast be? The length of podcasts vary. It's like asking how long a piece of string is. Podcast episodes can vary from 15 minutes to an hour. It depends on the topics that you'll be delving into in each episode. It's also important to keep in mind the attention span of listeners. You want to make sure that you're clear and catchy, and to consider what is really important and necessary in each episode. A run sheet helps you do this. Your run sheet is an essential part of planning your podcast and bringing all of the elements together. It will help you structure your episodes, and your run sheet is a success if any producer can read it and understand what needs to be recorded. It is a detailed production plan that lays out what each team member will be doing, what their roles are, the timing of the recording or how long each segment is going to be, the list of equipment that's going to be used, and any notes on the segments that you'll be discussing. Here we have an example of a basic podcast episode run sheet. So we can see that we have an intro, our segments, segues, and outro. A segue can either be the narrator or music, it's completely up to you. Then in our following column, we have who, roles. Here we would lay out what each team member's production role is, whether you be the presenter, the audio technician, editor, or researcher. Then we have notes and talking points. So any points that we want to make sure that we hit in each of our segments, we would write these down here so that the team is across it all. Then we have equipment and audio sources. This can be anything from any digital audio workstations you might be recording into, any devices that you're using. Then at the end we have time, and this tells us how long we would like each segment to be, which could be between 3 to 5 minutes or longer.
In our upcoming isolation creation videos, we'll be taking you through how to record from home and how to source sounds online. Thanks for tuning in today.